Elijah was an 8-year-old boy with a curious mind and a love for animals. On a warm Saturday morning, his parents decided to take him to the city zoo. It was a trip he had been looking forward to for weeks. With his favorite backpack slung over his shoulder and a notebook to jot down facts about the animals, Elijah was ready for an exciting day. The zoo was bustling with visitors. Children laughed and pointed at monkeys swinging from branches, while adults took pictures of towering giraffes. The aroma of popcorn and cotton candy filled the air, making the experience feel even more magical. Elijah was especially excited to see the lions. He had read about them in his animal books and even watched documentaries about their majestic lives in the wild. "Lions are the kings of the jungle," he often told his parents with pride. When they reached the lion enclosure, his eyes lit up. There they were, 2 enormous lions resting under a shady tree, their golden fur gleaming in the sunlight. As Elijah stood near the railing, his parents took out their camera to snap pictures. Meanwhile, a zoo employee named Martin stood nearby, watching the crowd. He was tall, with a stiff posture, and seemed to be in a rush. While other staff members smiled and chatted with visitors, Martin didn't look happy to be there. Elijah, however, was too focused on the lions to notice him. Elijah's parents decided to step away for a moment to grab some cold drinks. "Stay right here and don't move," his mom said. Elijah nodded, still mesmerized by the lions. The boy leaned over the railing just slightly to get a better view, unaware of what was about to happen. Martin suddenly approached Elijah. "Hey, kid," he said in a low voice. Elijah turned around, surprised but not alarmed. I need your help over here," Martin added, motioning toward the side of the enclosure. Elijah hesitated but followed, thinking it might be something about the lions. What happened next was so fast that Elijah barely had time to react. Martin lifted him up with surprising strength and placed him over the railing. Before Elijah could shout or call for help, Martin pushed him into the lion's enclosure. The crowd gasped in shock as Elijah landed on the soft grass inside the enclosure. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then the lions lifted their heads, their sharp eyes fixed on the small boy now standing in their territory. Elijah's heart raced. He could hear the screams of the crowd and the distant voice of his parents calling his name. The lions began to move toward him, their steps slow and deliberate. Elijah felt frozen, unsure of what to do next. But what happened after that moment would leave everyone, including the crowd, zoo staff, and even the lions, completely stunned. As Elijah stood frozen inside the lion's enclosure, time seemed to slow down. The crowd outside was in chaos. People screamed, pointing at the boy surrounded by the towering walls of the enclosure. Elijah's parents, who had just returned with drinks, dropped everything and rushed toward the commotion. "Elijah," his mother cried, her voice trembling with fear. Inside the enclosure, the 2 lions were now fully alert. They stood on their powerful legs, their eyes fixed on the small figure standing before them. Elijah could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with tension, and he could hear the rustle of the grass as the lions took cautious steps toward him. Elijah didn't know what to do. He remembered what he had learned from his animal books. Never run from a lion. Stay calm, stay still. But staying calm was easier said than done. His small hands trembled, and tears welled up in his eyes. He wanted to cry out for help, but he was too scared to make a sound. Meanwhile, outside the enclosure, the zoo staff sprang into action. An emergency alarm blared across the park, and security personnel arrived at the scene. Visitors were quickly ushered away from the area to prevent further panic. Among the staff was Mr. Hernandez, a senior animal handler who had worked with lions for over 20 years. He quickly took charge of the situation. "Get the tranquilizer gun," he ordered. "We need to act fast, but we can't afford to startle the lions." Back inside the enclosure, Elijah took small, shaky breaths. One of the lions, a large male with a thick golden mane, was now just a few feet away. The lion's deep amber eyes met Elijah's, and for a moment, something strange happened. The lion stopped. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying the boy, and let out a low, rumbling sound. Elijah didn't know if it was a growl or something else, but it didn't feel threatening. The lion's calmness seemed to spread to Elijah, and he stood a little steadier. The second lion, a female, circled around but didn't come any closer. The two lions exchanged glances, almost as if they were communicating with each other. The crowd outside watched in stunned silence. No one could believe what they were seeing. Elijah's parents begged the staff to do something quickly. "Please, save our son," his father shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. Mr. Hernandez approached the enclosure with the tranquilizer gun in hand. "Hold on, everyone," he said firmly. "We need to be careful. One wrong move, and we could make things worse." Martin, the zoo employee who had thrown Elijah into the enclosure, was nowhere to be seen. Some staff members began to suspect something unusual had happened. Why would a boy end up inside the enclosure? As they reviewed camera footage, the shocking truth about Martin's actions would soon come to light. But for now, all eyes remained on Elijah, the lions, and the fragile balance between danger and safety. Inside the lion's enclosure, the scene felt surreal. Elijah stood still, barely able to move as the two lions remained close to him. The golden male lion, with his thick mane flowing in the wind, walked around Elijah in slow, measured steps. His eyes were intense, but not aggressive. The female lion, smaller but no less fierce, kept a cautious distance, watching the boy with a curious gaze. Elijah felt as if he were trapped in a dream, unsure of what was real. His heart raced, but strangely, he felt no immediate danger from the lions. He remembered something his father had told him once. Animals can sense fear. If you stay calm, they might too. Elijah tried to focus on that advice. He took slow, deep breaths, his body trembling, but he kept his eyes locked on the lions, trying not to let fear take over. The crowd outside the enclosure was a mix of panic and disbelief. People screamed for help, trying to alert the zoo staff, but the scene seemed like something out of a movie. They had never expected this kind of situation at the zoo. A few visitors ran toward the exit in panic, but many others stayed, watching in silence, hoping for a miracle. Some even held their breath, as if they feared making a noise would upset the lions. From the other side of the enclosure, Mr. Hernandez and his team of animal handlers watched closely, waiting for the right moment to act. They knew that while tranquilizers could be useful, they also had risks. The lions were unpredictable in these conditions. A sudden dart could provoke them. And the last thing anyone wanted was to make the situation worse. As Elijah stood motionless, the male lion, who had been circling him, stopped right in front of him. It was only a few feet away now. The lion's gaze was intense, but not threatening. The large animal sniffed the air around Elijah, as if trying to understand who or what this strange creature was. For a moment, Elijah felt as though they were communicating without words. The lion's breath was warm, and Elijah could feel the weight of its stare. The female lion, still circling, seemed more cautious. She paced back and forth, but kept her distance, occasionally glancing at Elijah and then at the male lion. The two lions seemed to have an unspoken understanding. They weren't treating Elijah as prey. They were curious, almost as if they couldn't quite figure him out. Outside the enclosure, the staff continued to work quickly. A few more animal handlers arrived, bringing with them tools to safely extract Elijah from the lion's territory. "We need to move carefully," Mr. Hernandez instructed. "We can't risk alarming the lions." Elijah's parents were growing more frantic. They paced back and forth, pleading with the zoo staff to act faster. They couldn't understand how their son had ended up in this terrifying situation. How had he ended up in the lion's enclosure, and who had been responsible for it? But amidst the tension, something incredible was happening. The lions seemed to have no interest in harming Elijah. They stayed close, but not aggressively so. The crowd could only watch, stunned by the strange calmness of the animals, and the boy at the center of it all. As Mr. Hernandez and the team prepared for a rescue, everyone was left wondering what was going on with these lions, and would Elijah make it out unharmed? Inside the lion's enclosure, Elijah stood as still as possible. His body trembled, but he fought the urge to panic. His mind raced with questions. Why hadn't the lions attacked him yet? Was he in danger, or was there something about the situation that made the lions act differently? The male lion, whose mane gleamed like gold in the sun, remained close by. He didn't growl or snarl. Instead, he sniffed the air around Elijah, his gaze soft and curious. Elijah could feel the weight of the lion's stare, but it wasn't hostile. The lion's massive body stood tall, his muscles rippling with each step, yet there was a calmness in his movement that Elijah couldn't ignore. The male lion seemed to be sizing him up, but there was no aggression in his eyes. The female lion, a bit smaller but just as powerful, paced slowly around Elijah. She didn't seem as interested in getting closer, but her watchful eyes never left him. Every now and then, she would stop and look back at the male lion, as if waiting for him to decide what to do next. Elijah took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He remembered what he had read in his animal books. Lions, like many animals, could sense fear. They could tell if someone was calm or if they were frightened. Elijah focused on that idea, trying not to show his fear. Slowly, he straightened up, his hands trembling but his posture becoming less hunched. He didn't know how or why, but in that moment, he felt as though he could try something different. He would trust the lions, even if it was just for a moment. Outside the enclosure, people were still shouting. Elijah's parents were frantically asking for help, their voices echoing across the zoo. The zoo staff, led by Mr. Hernandez, was working hard to find a way to get Elijah out safely. Everyone was focused on the lions, watching carefully to see if they would make a move. It was strange. Most people expected lions to be unpredictable in such a situation. But these lions seemed different. They were calm, almost too calm. Mr. Hernandez had worked with lions for years, but even he was surprised by what he was witnessing. He could tell that these lions weren't acting like typical wild animals. The way they moved around Elijah without attacking was unusual. "I've never seen anything like this before," he muttered, speaking more to himself than anyone else. His team continued to stand by, ready to intervene if necessary, but they also knew that any sudden action could cause the lions to react violently. Meanwhile, Elijah stayed as calm as he could. The male lion took a few more steps forward, stopping just inches away from him. Elijah didn't move. His eyes stayed locked with the lion's amber gaze, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The world outside the enclosure felt distant, almost like it didn't matter. All that mattered now was staying calm, staying still, and hoping that the lions would let him go without harm. Then, as if on cue, the male lion turned around and slowly walked back to the center of the enclosure. The female lion followed him, and they both lay down on the soft grass, watching Elijah from a distance. They seemed content to observe him, their eyes softening with time. For the first time since Elijah had been thrown into the enclosure, a sense of relief washed over him. He wasn't out of danger yet, but the lions were no longer a threat. They were simply there. Outside the enclosure, the crowd began to quiet down. People held their breath, amazed by what was happening. No one could understand why the lions had behaved this way, but one thing was certain. Elijah was still alive, and the lions weren't attacking. Outside the lion's enclosure, the air was thick with tension. The crowd had gone quiet, but the shock and fear were still there, hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. Elijah, still inside the enclosure, stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the two lions who were now sitting calmly on the grass. The zoo staff, led by Mr. Hernandez, were carefully making their way toward the enclosure, trying to come up with a plan to rescue Elijah without alarming the lions. Elijah's parents stood at the edge of the zoo grounds, their faces pale with worry. They had never imagined that their trip to the zoo would turn into a nightmare. "Please," Elijah's mother whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, save him." Her eyes were glued to the scene inside the enclosure, praying that her son would be okay. Mr. Hernandez took a deep breath and assessed the situation. He had worked with dangerous animals for years, but this was unlike anything he had ever faced. He had never seen lions act this way, so calm and almost protective of Elijah. Still, they were wild animals, and anything could happen in an instant. "We need to get him out now," Mr. Hernandez said, his voice steady but urgent. He turned to his team of animal handlers, giving them instructions. "Prepare the rescue harness and make sure we have backup in case the lions become unpredictable." A few handlers moved quickly, setting up ropes and a harness near the enclosure. Another handler was ready with a tranquilizer gun, just in case things went wrong. They knew they had to act quickly but carefully. One wrong move, and the situation could change in an instant. Inside the enclosure, Elijah was still standing still, his legs aching from the effort to stay calm. The male lion lay down again, his golden mane spread out like a blanket of light against the grass. The female lion was still nearby, but she had also settled down. Elijah felt a strange sense of relief. The lions hadn't attacked him, and they weren't acting aggressively. Still, he knew he couldn't stay there forever. His parents were outside, desperately waiting for him to be safe. The zoo staff were doing everything they could, but the moment was far from over. Elijah heard Mr. Hernandez's voice calling out to him from the edge of the enclosure. "Elijah, we're coming to get you. Stay calm. Everything will be okay." Elijah turned toward the voice, feeling a wave of hope wash over him. The sound of the handler's footsteps grew closer, and he knew they were almost there. The lions, sensing the movement around them, lifted their heads slightly. They didn't seem to be bothered, but they watched the staff closely. Mr. Hernandez and his team reached the edge of the enclosure. Slowly, carefully, they lowered the harness into the area where Elijah was standing. "Elijah," Mr. Hernandez called softly, "we need you to come toward us. But don't run. Walk slowly." Elijah nodded, his heart pounding. He took one last look at the lions, who were still sitting calmly, watching him with what almost seemed like curiosity. Then, slowly, he took a few steps toward the rescue team, his body tense but determined. As he approached the harness, one of the handlers reached out and gently pulled him in. The lions watched from a distance, their eyes following Elijah's every move, but they made no attempt to stop him. It was as if they had decided to let him go. The rescue was complete. Elijah was safe. As he was pulled out of the enclosure, he could feel the weight of the situation finally lift. The crowd outside erupted into applause, but all Elijah could think about was the strange calmness of the lions and how, against all odds, he had made it out of the enclosure unharmed. His parents rushed toward him, tears streaming down their faces. "Elijah, you're safe," his mother cried, hugging him tightly. "You're okay." Elijah smiled, relieved but exhausted. He was safe, but the memory of what had just happened would stay with him forever. As the zoo staff rushed to secure the lion's enclosure and comfort Elijah, a deep sense of relief washed over the crowd. The danger was over, but the mystery of how Elijah ended up in the lion's territory was far from solved. People continued to whisper, pointing fingers and trying to piece together what had happened. How had Elijah been thrown into the lion's enclosure? It was impossible to ignore the strange events that had led to such a terrifying moment. Outside the enclosure, Mr. Hernandez stood with a serious expression. He had seen many wild animals in his years at the zoo, but nothing like this. Elijah's calmness had been a miracle, and the lion's unexpected behavior had baffled everyone. But there was something else, something that needed to be uncovered. "Where is Martin?" Mr. Hernandez asked the other zoo staff. Martin, the employee who had been nearby when Elijah was thrown into the enclosure, had disappeared. He had been part of the staff for several years, but today his actions were strange, to say the least. A few minutes later, one of the staff members returned, shaking his head. "We can't find him. It's like he vanished after the incident." Mr. Hernandez frowned, his suspicion growing. "He needs to be found. I don't like this. Something isn't right." Meanwhile, Elijah was sitting on a bench, his parents beside him, trying to comfort him. He was still in shock, but his mind was beginning to clear. He didn't understand why Martin had done what he did. The man had seemed so normal, so friendly earlier in the day. But now, Elijah felt a deep unease when he thought about how Martin had grabbed him and thrown him into the lion's enclosure without any warning. "I don't know why he did it," Elijah said softly, looking up at his parents. "He just grabbed me, and then I was in the cage." Elijah's mother hugged him tightly, not knowing what to say. She was grateful that her son was safe, but she also felt a growing sense of anger and confusion. Who would do something so cruel? Hours passed, and the authorities were called in to investigate. Police arrived, questioning zoo staff and gathering information. Everyone who had been near the scene that day was interviewed. Finally, after searching the zoo, they found Martin hiding in a storage room. His face was pale, and he looked anxious, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "Martin," the officer said sternly, "we need to talk." The zoo staff and Elijah's family gathered around as the officers began to question Martin. He was quiet at first, refusing to say much, but after a while, the truth began to unfold. It turned out that Martin had been dealing with deep personal struggles. He had been facing a number of challenges in his life, and his bitterness had started to spill over into his work. He had been harboring a secret grudge against the zoo, feeling overlooked and underappreciated. In a moment of extreme anger and frustration, he had made a terrible decision, one that he would regret for the rest of his life. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Martin finally admitted, his voice shaky. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I just did something stupid." The officers took Martin into custody, and he was charged with reckless endangerment. He would have to face the consequences of his actions. But for Elijah, the truth didn't bring any relief. The man who had put him in danger wasn't a stranger. He was someone who had worked alongside the staff for years. As the investigation continued, many questions remained unanswered. How had Martin's anger led to such a dangerous act? And how had the lions reacted the way they did? What had caused them to show such calmness in the face of danger? While the answers to those questions would come later, one thing was clear. Elijah's life had been forever changed by the events of that day. The danger had passed, but the mystery of what had truly happened would linger in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. The next few days felt like a blur to Elijah. He had always loved animals, especially lions, and had dreamed of one day working with them. But now, everything had changed. The images of the lions circling him, their large eyes watching him so closely, were burned into his memory. His parents tried to keep things as normal as possible, but it was hard for Elijah to forget what had happened. At night, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moments inside the lion's enclosure. He remembered how still the lions had been, how they hadn't attacked him. It was strange, almost like they were waiting for him to do something. He didn't understand why they hadn't hurt him. Was it because he had stayed calm? Or had they sensed something in him that made them decide not to attack? One evening after school, Elijah sat down with his mother in the living room. She had noticed how quiet he had become lately, how he seemed to be lost in thought. "Elijah," she said gently, "you can talk to me if you're feeling scared or confused. I'm here for you." Elijah took a deep breath and looked at her. "I keep thinking about the lions, Mom," he said softly. "I don't know why they didn't hurt me. I thought they would attack me for sure." His mother hugged him tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Elijah. You stayed so calm. That's what kept you safe. You were brave when things got scary." Elijah nodded, though he still felt confused. He wasn't sure what had kept him calm in the face of danger. He had always been a bit of a worrywart, afraid of things he couldn't control. But in that moment, when he was thrown into the lion's enclosure, something had shifted in him. He hadn't run or screamed. He had remembered what he'd read about animals. If you stay still and calm, they might not hurt you. It had worked, but he didn't fully understand why. The next day at school, Elijah's story had spread. His classmates had heard about what happened at the zoo, and they were full of questions. Some were curious, others amazed. "You were in the lion's den?" "For real?" one of his friends asked, wide-eyed. Elijah nodded, trying to smile. "Yeah, but the lions didn't hurt me." "Wow, that's so cool. You're like a hero," his friend replied, looking impressed. Elijah wasn't sure if he felt like a hero. He didn't think he had done anything special. He had just stayed calm. He didn't want anyone to think he was some sort of superhero. The lions had been the real mystery. Why had they behaved like that? Was it because they were used to humans? Or was it something more? Elijah couldn't stop thinking about it. After school, Elijah asked his mom if they could visit the zoo again. He wanted to understand more about what had happened, and he hoped that seeing the lions again might give him some answers. His mom agreed, though she was still nervous about the idea. "Are you sure, Elijah? I know it was scary for you." "I think I need to see them again," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I want to understand why they didn't hurt me." The next weekend, Elijah and his parents returned to the zoo. The lions were in their enclosure, resting in the sun, just like before. Elijah stood at the railing, looking at them closely. They didn't seem any different, but he felt something different inside himself. He wasn't afraid anymore. He didn't know what had made the lions act the way they did, but one thing was clear. The lions weren't just wild animals. They were part of a larger world that Elijah had begun to understand a little better. And in that moment, he realized that his bravery didn't come from understanding the lions. It came from within himself. As the days passed, people began to wonder about the two lions who had acted so strangely during Elijah's terrifying ordeal. The zoo was flooded with questions. Why hadn't the lions attacked Elijah? Were they used to humans? Could the animals sense his fear or calmness? The zoo staff called in animal behaviorists to study the lions' actions. These experts had worked with wild animals for years, but they admitted they had never seen anything quite like this. The lions had displayed calmness and curiosity instead of attacking a stranger in their territory. It was unusual, even for animals that had been raised in captivity. Dr. Alice Turner, an experienced animal behaviorist, spoke to the media about the lions' behavior. Lions, like most wild animals, act on instinct. They are typically territorial and may see humans as a threat. But in this case, the lions' actions were quite unusual, she explained. They didn't act aggressively toward Elijah, even when he was in their space. Instead, they stayed calm, watched him closely, and only circled him. It's as if they were trying to understand him. Dr. Turner's explanation helped the public make sense of the lion's strange behavior. She speculated that the lion's calmness could be attributed to their unusual upbringing. Both lions had been raised in the zoo from a young age and were used to human presence. The zoo staff regularly worked with the animals, feeding them and cleaning their enclosures. Perhaps in the lions' eyes, Elijah was just another human, and they saw no reason to treat him as a threat. But there was more to it. The behaviorists also suggested that the lions could have sensed Elijah's emotions. Animals, especially those with sharp instincts like lions, are known to be able to pick up on subtle cues, such as body language and the scent of fear. Elijah had remained calm, and perhaps the lions had noticed this and reacted differently than they would have with someone who was panicking. Despite the scientific explanations, the story of Elijah's survival continued to capture the public's imagination. It was as if something more than just instinct had been at play. Many people believed there was a deeper connection between the boy and the lions, something that couldn't be explained by science alone. Elijah's parents were both relieved and thankful that their son had made it out unharmed. They were still shaken by the events, but they also felt proud of Elijah's bravery. They knew that his calmness had played a huge role in keeping him safe, but they also felt a sense of wonder about the lion's strange behavior. The zoo, too, had learned a lot from the incident. The staff had spent hours reviewing the footage and studying the lion's behavior. They decided to make some changes to their security measures to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. While the zoo was committed to the well-being of both the animals and the visitors, they also knew that this incident had raised many important questions about the relationship between humans and wild animals. As the weeks went by, the story of Elijah and the lions became a symbol of bravery, calmness, and understanding. Elijah had shown the world that sometimes, even in the most dangerous situations, staying calm could make all the difference. And the lions, who had been the cause of so much fear, had somehow become part of a larger story about courage and the mysterious connections between humans and animals. Weeks passed, and life began to return to normal for Elijah and his family. The incident at the zoo had shaken them, but they were grateful that their son had made it out unharmed. Elijah had become a local hero in his town, and his stories spread across the news. People were amazed by how brave and calm he had been in the face of danger, and many admired his ability to stay composed when most others would have panicked. But while Elijah's bravery was celebrated, the question of what had truly happened at the zoo still lingered. Martin, the zoo employee who had thrown Elijah into the lion's enclosure, had been arrested and charged with reckless endangerment. The authorities had investigated his actions, and it was soon revealed that Martin had been struggling with personal issues that had affected his judgment. He had been dealing with anger and frustration for months, feeling unappreciated and overlooked by his colleagues at the zoo. Martin admitted to acting out of anger, saying he had made a terrible decision in a moment of emotional instability. His actions were shocking, and it was hard for many people to understand how someone who had worked at the zoo for years could do something so dangerous and cruel. Martin's arrest and the investigation sparked a larger conversation about the importance of mental health support for employees, especially in high-stress jobs like those at a zoo. As the legal proceedings against Martin moved forward, the zoo made significant changes to ensure something like this would never happen again. They introduced new training programs for staff members, focusing not only on animal care, but also on mental health awareness and conflict resolution. The zoo wanted to make sure that all its employees were supported and that incidents like this would be prevented in the future. They also increased security around the animal enclosures and created a more comprehensive emergency response plan to protect visitors and staff. In the months that followed, Elijah continued to process what had happened. He had been invited to speak at local events, sharing his experience with others. Though he still felt a little scared when he thought about the lions, he had come to understand that his calmness had helped him survive that day. He realized that his ability to stay composed had played a big role in the outcome, and he felt proud of how he had handled the situation. One day, Elijah's parents decided to take him back to the zoo. They had promised him that they would return, but only when Elijah felt ready. Elijah had asked to visit the lions again, curious to see them in person after everything that had happened. When they arrived, the lions were resting peacefully in their enclosure, just like before. Elijah stood at the railing, his heart calm, no longer filled with fear. As he watched the lions, Elijah understood that they were not the cause of the danger. It had been Martin's actions that had put him at risk. The lions, though powerful and wild, had not harmed him. In fact, they had shown him an unexpected kindness. Elijah smiled as he thought about how the lions had simply allowed him to leave the enclosure unharmed. He now felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had faced his fear and learned something important from the experience. In the end, the events of that day changed Elijah's life forever. He had shown incredible bravery, and his story became a symbol of strength and resilience. The zoo had learned valuable lessons too, and new measures were in place to protect both the animals and the visitors. As for Elijah, he had come to realize that sometimes, even in the most frightening situations, staying calm and being brave can make all the difference. This final part brings closure to the story while highlighting the